Hello and welcome to Better Under Pressure. I'm Sara Milne Rowe, author of The Shed Method and founder of Coaching Impact. And in this podcast, I talk to leaders from all walks of life about being better under pressure and using pressure for better. I want to explore how we handle pressure in a world that is becoming more and more complex, the impact that pressure has on our ability to perform at our best, and what we do to be better under pressure.
My work requires me to travel a lot. I'm away from home a lot. So there's the emotional pressure of that. There's just the logistical pressures. I'm doing a lot of really mentally taxing work. So again, feeling like I'm not getting to be as creative as I tend to need. And so it's like, how can I start doing all of the stuff that I know I need, right? Like building in more time for my creativity, writing for writing's sake, as opposed to for, some article or whatever. And so that's how I know. It's like the early warning signs are the resentment and the anger towards someone who more often than not has nothing to do with what is actually going on.
Today I'm talking to Rupal Patel, a woman who's had an unconventional career as suggested by the title of her best-selling book, From CIA to CEO. As a CIA analyst and field agent, she advised 4-star generals, earned war zone service medals, and was recognised by the CIA director for superior support to the president. She then left to start in business. Rupal's trailblazing business work has featured in USA Today and Business Insider, and in 2023 she was named one of the most influential women of the year. She's committed to developing the next generation of leaders and change makers through pro bono work for Virgin Startup and through her roles as entrepreneur in residence at London Business School and alumni in residence at the University of Chicago. In our conversation, Rupal shares what can be gained from riddles over dinner, the creative benefits of leaving things to the last minute, and what she discovered by leaning into the laziness. Rupal, it's so good to have you on. Finally, we've done it.
We have.
Good. So you've had an extraordinary journey, and you and I have talked at different stages along the way, but it would be so good just to have this solid time to sort of join up some dots and wrap it around pressure.
Yeah.
So tell me, when do you first remember the feeling of pressure?
Oh, that's a good one. Gosh, this is taking me way back to when I was in school, and I played football, soccer from the age of 6 onwards. And I remember it wasn't that early on, but it was relatively early in my sort of soccer career, as it was, that I remember the pressure of wanting to win. And not just because I wanted to win. I wasn't as competitive as a child as I am as an adult now, but it was more not wanting to let my team down and not wanting to suck, basically, right? To not want to, just wanting to be good at this thing that I had chosen to pursue. I remember the nerves before and during, the first seconds when we're all on the pitch before the ref blows the whistle, and just feeling that anxiety and that pressure of what's this going to be like? What's this going to be like? And then also I remember, and this is such a parallel for sort of pressure and how I experience it even now, the second I get moving, it almost always goes away. The physicality of sport in particular, I think is such a powerful analogy. But yeah, for me, it was that pressure didn't go away, but the weight of the pressure went away, right? There was still that motivation, that desire to succeed, to do well, to not let the team down, etc. But once I started moving and then things were just happening, you sort of were in the moment and you couldn't stay stuck in your head obsessing over the what ifs and how does this going to happen, and all of that scenario catastrophizing that sometimes happens when we're under a lot of pressure. So yeah, it was on the football pitch.
Wow. Well, first of all, I didn't even know that you did play soccer at such a young age. That's incredible. Yeah. But also what I'm hearing through that story is that it was a good feeling, actually.
Yeah.
It didn't feel like it was... You were in control of it.
Yes and no. I mean, because again, I was quite young, and I think it started out as it always felt like it was a negative stress. Okay. And again, this burden, this weight, this anxiety, this uncontrollable of oh my God, what's going to happen? But then in every discrete, almost without exception, I feel like in every discrete game, it went away and it evolved into
Yeah.
a more positive pressure that felt manageable, that felt like, well, now we're in it, right? So like there's nothing to do but just do the doing, as opposed to obsessing over the potential scenario. So yeah, I think it moved from a negative-ish sort of heavy weight to something a little bit more more motivating and more yeah, I guess a positive sort of pressure.
Yes, because the gateway seems to be physical movement.
Yeah, in that context, for sure.
Yeah. Is it
Yeah.
still the same for you?
In some ways, I think, I never thought about it until you've asked it in this way. And I'm trying to think. So, for example, I do a lot of public speaking, and
Yeah.
there are times in that, like, 3 minutes before I go on stage, right, where my heart is racing, where my heart, where like I'm just looking around the room, trying to read the energy, trying to get a sense of like, what do they need? How are they going to react? All of that's again getting back in my head. And then as I'm like on the stage, it's always the first 10 seconds, right? It's like just open your mouth and get going. And then after that happens, then it turns again into that much more dynamic, positive energy exchange of like paying attention again in real time while I'm doing the delivery. Then it's a more creative, positive pressure, as opposed to feeling like, oh, I can't do this, I can't do this. So yeah, in that context, for sure, it is definitely the again moving, I guess, moving my mouth.
Yeah, it's true.
But yeah, I have found that to be the case. And then I'm just thinking, about sort of more discrete, like work specific things when I'm feeling under pressure. And more often than not, the movement is a medicine, even if it's not related to what I'm doing. So it's not like I can check emails while I'm on the go, but I find that when I make the time, and I'm not very good at making the time, when I do make the time to just be in my body instead of in my head, it's worth every second of that trade-off. It feels like, oh, I don't have the time, I can't do this, I'm so under the gun. But actually, the times I've forced myself to go and just be physical, it has really, really helped with the mental.
Yeah. I love that. The medicine of the movement. That's a good phrase.
Yeah, thanks. I think I just coined it.
Yeah, you did. There we go. So if we go to your career in the CIA, how did pressure turn up there?
Gosh, in many ways. So there was always the internal pressure. I am by nature I'll say high performer, because I've always pushed myself to try to be the best that I could be, sometimes in comparison to others, but more often than not, just what can I do? How can I sort of up my own game? So there was always that internal drive to succeed, to do well, to test myself, to see what I was made of effectively. And then there was the team pressure, right? Because we're working on high stakes issues, and there's just a lot to deal with at any given time. And then there's the bigger picture sort of organizational pressure. And then more globally, I mean, it's literal. It's like an international pressure of like, again, the stakes are really, really high. We're advising the president, we're advising, sort of the Pentagon and all of these decision makers on literal life or death scenarios. And that is not a responsibility that anyone can take lightly. And so I think it was just knowing. It's interesting. I think for me, that pressure was those many layers of pressure, but it was always that sense of let's do what we can do, control the controllables.
Yeah.
And then you just have to let it go. Like it literally is this, yes, you take it seriously, it's heavy, it's intense, and everybody, myself included, did sort of feel that weight. But after you did what you could do, I mean, there's literally nothing else that you can do, right? And so I think that internalization really hit me from a very early stage in my career there, because you can do the analysis, you can do the briefing, you can do the intelligence reporting or whatever, and you sort of tell the president X, Y, or Z, and then what he does with that information is totally out of your control. And separating that was really hard for me in the beginning, because I'm a doer, right? I want to fix things. I want to be a part of a solution. I want to be able to like get my hands dirty in the process. And I couldn't do that in that context. And so it was a really important lesson, I think, in acknowledging the boundaries of what you can control and what you can impact, and
Hmm.
not letting the pressure of everything else be too much of a weight, because you can't affect things beyond sort of a relatively narrow, little radius. So that's how it showed up there. And I think, in some ways it was very energizing, because there was always something to do, there were always problems to solve or things going on. But I was also really, really lucky to be surrounded by people who constantly had either really high expectations, and so sort of, by setting the bar really high, forced me to again raise my performance to it, or were just alongside with me, like just doing the best that they could. And that combination of like just sheer brain power and then camaraderie was
Yeah.
a really powerful combination.
Yeah. How did you judge? So as you were fresh in to that
Mm,
job and that role,
yeah.
I'm making some sort of like links here with, people who's starting something new that feels slightly bigger than them,
Yeah, yeah,
and they've not necessarily done it before.
yeah.
They may be in that sphere, but they're not
Yeah,
necessarily, known for that specialism.
yeah,
How do you turn the pressure of that, Rupal? I don't know if you can remember this or whether
yeah,
this is still going on for all of us, as we
yeah,
raise our game,
yeah.
but when's the tipping point for you, and how have you worked with that tipping point of when the energy of raising your game
Mm,
is a pressure, but it's a
yeah,
sort of an exhilarating pressure,
yeah.
into being judged or the fear of failure or not being good enough? How did you walk that line?
Oh, I
Because also you were a
remember.
woman, right? You were a woman, you're
Yeah,
a
yeah,
woman of color, like
yeah,
all of
yeah,
those other things that you
yeah,
throw in the mix there,
yeah,
right?
yeah. So yeah, that's interesting. I think for me, it was a couple of things. It was one, just having some basic confidence in my abilities, right? I know that if nothing else, I will always try and I will always learn. So those two things in combination just always give me, even now when I'm constantly doing things that terrify me, right? Like I've done hard things out that I've never been able to do before. So it's one, just remembering that, but this other thing of like just being willing to learn and having the humility. I think that's something else that I definitely have recognized, is that I have the humility to take on constructive feedback. And there was a time, especially in the early days as a young agency officer, where I was getting everything wrong, right? But that was because I didn't know. Like, you're in this totally, it's not just the technology and the processes of how things are done. It's like the craft of intelligence and being an analyst, and working within this organization that has this remit and responsibility. And I remember telling myself, just let yourself suck for a little while, right? Like, you can't get it right. You don't know whether you're getting it right or not. All you can do is make your best effort, and then be willing to take guidance, advice, mentoring, whatever, from those who do know a bit better, and having the
Mm.
humility to accept that you don't have all the answers. Even as you sort of get more and more senior, you never can have all the answers, but that if there are smart people around you who you trust, who have the experience and have the credibility, then always either take on their feedback or actively solicit it. And I remember
Mm.
so vividly, I mean, physically, like I can see it in front of me, the first paper I ever wrote for the agency, and it goes through this very long process of like of vetting and collaboration and sort of sense checking and all of this stuff. But the first step was my mentor, experienced intelligence officer. He looked it over and he came back, and it was literally blood red with comments like,
Mm.
"This is wrong," or "Check this," or "What about this," and like all of these, both very tangible, like just this, you got the technique wrong, as well as the like, you need to go back and think through your analysis on these points, right? And at first, like the Lisa Simpson, sort of like used to getting A stars at everything in school
Yeah.
person in me, was like, what the hell is this? Like, I'm a good writer, I'm a smart person, how is it? And then literally within seconds it was like, oh, I've never worked at the CIA before, right? So I
Mm.
can't perfect it on day 10 or whatever it was, because I don't have the body of experience this guy does. I'm gonna do myself the favor of listening to his feedback, because he was also really well respected, right? So it was a
Right.
combination of like, he had the
Yeah.
credibility, he had the experience. Like, I'd be stupid to be like, oh no, my ego is like telling me that I'm smart, and like, who are you? And I think that is something that I've taken with me, throughout my whole career, right? It's just this willingness to accept feedback when it is constructive. And again, that thing of like, is the person giving it qualified to give it? Do they have the experience? Do they share my values? Are they a good person? Like, is their input, does it matter? And being able to filter that from some of the purely hateful feedback, right, that you can get especially sometimes, a woman or a woman of color, whatever, any combination, or just as a human being, right? Some people just like to be hateful. So that was how I managed it. It was always being willing to learn, being very happy, being out of my depth, being the dumbest person in the room, not relishing in it, right? Not being like, oh, I'm just going to stay ignorant, but like being willing to learn from smart people is a really underutilized skill, especially as what I see in a lot of the work I do with companies now is like, not always, but there are some very senior people who, of course, got to where they are because they're smart, they're capable, they're good technocrats, whatever it is, but have so much faith in their own expertise or their own, almost are overconfident that they're just unwilling to consider that other people also have good ideas. And so for me, I've never had that problem. And I think that's really helps manage the pressure as well, because also suddenly you don't have to come up with all the answers yourself, right? You don't have to be this like all knowing, all seeing, like omnipotent being. You just have to be willing to learn. And then of course, use your own, sort of good common sense or good, whatever brain power to decide what is the next best step. But I never go in assuming that like I have it all figured out. And I think it does just depressurize even really, really intense situations because I'm willing to ask for help. I'm willing to, admit when I'm in over my head. I'm better at it sometimes than others. I'm not, but I think that's what it requires. There's just a lot going on and we can't do it all in the sort of in our own little sort of bubbles. We need to be willing to ask for help and to acknowledge when we need it.
How did you learn that though, Rupal? Because there would be other people that I'm sure you work with, that I work with, who would find that humility. Well, actually, you got a heady combination there of, you said basic confidence and humility.
Yeah.
There's two skills in there for me. How do you remind yourself of your basic confidence? How do you step into your own confidence first and then allow the humility in to be able to then be open to learning and open to asking and opening to listen? You must have learned that from someone. Or is it just been, might I say that? I mean, I don't know for sure, but some people find that incredibly difficult and find it humiliating.
Yeah. It's interesting. So the basic confidence, I think, came from two things. One, from just, I was always good at school. And I know that sounds really sort of simplistic, but I got straight A's my whole life. Like from a very academic perspective, like I just knew I was a smart person or that, I could do well at school. Right. So that, just that sort of, maybe in some ways it was an external reflection, right? Of like, okay, well, I'm going to do my hardest. I'm going to study. I mean, I love learning, right? I always have. And so at school, it was like, I'm going to try, I'm going to study, I'm going to do well. And then, or I'm going to try to do well. And then I did. And so it just was reinforced throughout, the first, whatever, 20 of my years of my life, right? That I just got good grades. Some of it was also, I grew up, in a family where like, my dad was always trying to catch us out. So he would he's an incredibly smart human being. And at the dinner table, he'd quiz us. He'd give us these like riddles around like, just logic or reasoning or math or whatever, because that's just who he is. And he'd sort of set us up in a way where it was like, oh, you think you get a bit cocky. And then he's like, no, look, here's the hidden side of this thing. And it was a little, I'm not going to lie, it was a little bit obnoxious at times, right? Because I'm like, dude, like, I'm just trying to eat my dinner here. Can we just, leave this for another time? But the thing he did sometimes, not always, was like, then work us through the process, right? As here's why you got that wrong, because you didn't think about this, or he's a very analytical, has like an engineering brain, right? And I think being exposed to that and then actually being like engaged with that way of thinking and deconstructing the world and problems was something that I picked up from that experience to some extent, And so now for me, it's like, understanding the fundamentals, breaking things down to their very like core is a skill that was honed at home. Of course, it was further honed at the CIA. But like, again, for me, part of that involved that you need to then be willing to be surprised, right? Like as you're doing this investigation, it's not always going to come up with the results that you expect it to, right? And that's sort of that scientific mindset of like, ask the good questions, do the experiment, but don't assume the outcome, right? Be willing to be surprised. And that is somewhat linked to this idea of humility, right? Like you think you're putting in your best effort, and then you get this constructive feedback and you realize, oh, well, actually, they're right, right? It's not always right. I mean, people can give you feedback that is meant to be constructive. And actually, there have been times where I'm like, no, I think I got it right the first time, right? I appreciate where that's coming from. But I sort of I know in my gut that this is more accurate, or this is the better way, or whatever it is, right? I've gotten now very slowly to a place where I need less external confirmation. And sometimes I just know, you know what? This was really damn good. Even if you didn't appreciate it, or even if it didn't land in the way I anticipated, or was whatever it is, I just know that it's good. And I think that has been a really hard thing to come to, because it goes in the face of some of what we just talked about, that humility, that willingness to be proven wrong, et cetera, et cetera. But I think because I am open, when I shut down, I know it's for a good reason, if that makes sense, right?
Like trust
when
it.
Exactly. I can trust myself now to be like, no, you know what? Even though like the feedback was this, or like the response was that, I'm good. Like it's not everybody's right all the time, including myself. But in this one, I'm happy with what happened, or I'm happy with the way I did what I did, or the way, the conclusion I came up with, or whatever it was. So it's a dynamic. It's not like it's a static thing. Like it's 50% humility, 50% like confidence. It's
ever shifting and ever evolving. It sounds as well.
Exactly. Yeah.
This dance that Rupal is talking about here between confidence and humility is so relevant, and one actually that's been interesting me for a while now. Often the pressure we place on ourselves to get it right has the ability to rock both of the skills that Rupal's referring to here, our confidence and our humility, our willingness to learn. I loved it when she said we can all de-pressure, love that word, by asking for help. I find asking for help really difficult. It's a joke in our house that I will hint rather than ask. And yet I know how powerful it is for teams to witness a leader who actually asks for help and is open to learning. It's clear that Rupal's been drilled in a way from a young age by her father to expect this useful interrogation of her beliefs and her ideas. And she's learned that the interrogation can often mean more learning rather than any reduction of her or her self-belief. It's now a strong and well-honed muscle for her. It also means that she's now very comfortable in saying, yep, thanks for that feedback, but you know what? I'm standing by what I believe. We often forget that it's our choice to take on the feedback we're offered or not. And that often depends on the credibility and respect that you have from the person that it's coming from. She's talking about skills here, when to be open and when, in her words, shut down and know, you know what? I'm happy enough with how I did. Let's run through the approach that she's just mentioned. 1. Ask the big question. 2. Do the experiment. That word, by the way, is key. 3. Be unattached to the outcome. And 4. Be willing to be surprised. That's such an interesting question to ask. How willing are we to be surprised, particularly when we're under pressure and given something our best shot? How do we hold both these things in equal partnership? That we can be open to surprise and confident that we've done our best. Not right, not wrong, our best, and open to learning more. What part of that partnership do you think needs more attention? Your confidence or your humility? And who would benefit? What would you say, Rupal, is the worst pressure you've ever been under?
I'll sort of define worst in a specific way, because it came immediately to my mind when you asked it.
Okay.
The worst pressure for me is the type of pressure that I feel I don't, and this is maybe a bit circular, but that I just don't handle very well.
Mm-hmm.
I can handle intellectual pressure. I can handle work pressure, professional pressure. What I cannot handle well is emotional pressure. And for me, how that shows up is more often than not at home. I mean, sometimes with my team and with people I'm working with or whatever, but more often than not at home. And maybe it's because of, it's that like, maybe pressure is like you have an allocation every day and you can handle
Yeah.
so much. And then once it gets to a certain point, I don't know, right? But where I find I really struggle is with the emotional side, because I have two young kids still, a 4-year-old, almost 4-year-old, and a 7-year-old. And sometimes it's just really hard. And
Yeah.
then, and like they're so needy still. And I have so many things going on in my mind at so many different times, and trying to manage how I show up at home versus how I show up at work, and trying to be not perfect, but to just at least feel like proud of how I am in every context. I don't
Mm.
always get it right. Well, I definitely don't always get it right.
Mm.
But at home, I think is probably where I struggle the most. And because even if I don't externally show it, like internally, I find myself constantly, if I am really hard on myself, it's with my personal stuff, on like, oh
Yeah.
God, I messed up that conversation with my daughter, I should have handled that thing differently. And I think that for me is something I'm still really working on. And if I
Yeah.
may, it's something that you have said before. I heard it again recently, and I just thought, God, I'm going to practice this. And it's really, really helped, is this idea of choosing your mood,
Yeah.
and choosing how you want to show up. And
Yeah.
it's been helpful in like making that transition as I am winding down my workday, going into home mode. Like, how do I want to show up? Like, who do I
Yeah.
want to be? What mood do I want to greet my children with when they see me at the end of their very long day? So
Yeah.
I think that's for me is the focus, to be honest, right now. And I think some of it, maybe this is TMI for your audience, but I also find I'm getting into this like perimenopausal
Mm.
hormonal scenario that I've never experienced before. And I don't know
Mm.
how much of it is that versus how much of it is just life piling on top of life. Who knows, right? But I
Mm-hmm.
find that just that little thing of like choosing my mood, choosing how I want to show up, has really helped shift some of what felt like, oh, I can't do this.
Yeah. Yeah. And of course, it does take effort, doesn't it, to do that?
Oof.
That's the thing. So if you've
Yeah.
given it, I mean, I think your whole point about this battery of how much you've got left to be able to do that is,
Yeah.
and where you've given your energy,
Yeah.
it's all
Exactly.
it's all part of this equation of our ability to do it.
Yeah.
It's so tough, isn't it, when the people that you love the most
Get the worst of
get
you.
the remnants, get the remnants of what little energy you've got
Yeah,
left.
exactly.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
a tough one, really,
Yeah.
really tough one.
Yeah.
So in terms of your work now,
Yeah.
you touched on it a little bit there, Rupal. It seems like you've really expanded your bandwidth to
Mm-hmm.
your range of ability
Yeah.
to manage various different pressures over your
Yeah.
journey. Something that I'm always intrigued about when I'm working with clients is their capacity for dealing with others' pressure,
Mm-hmm.
or other people who maybe are feeling pressure when they're looking at it and thinking, really?
Yeah.
Honestly? Come on.
Yeah.
That sort
Yeah.
of feeling.
Yeah.
How do you, when you've got such an evolved sense of your range, how do you manage other people's pressure? Or how do
Yeah.
you witness other people
That's it.
dealing with other people's pressure?
It's a couple of things. One thing, it's funny when the way you put it there is just like, really, why is that affecting you in that way? Like whenever I find myself in, even just mentally having that conversation, is to flip it into curiosity, right? To just,
Mm.
instead of being like, oh, why are you feeling that way, to actually, why are you feeling that way, right? And maybe you frame it in a different way when in engaging with that person. But for me, it's sometimes it's a direct engagement and just trying to understand, okay, that's not how I would interpret it or internalize it, but let's get to the bottom of this, like what's going on here. Because as we all know, though we're not, and I will put my hand up as well, that we're not as good at acknowledging, is like everybody else is coming with their own bags full of stuff that they're carrying around with them, right? And we assume that we know people after a certain amount of time has elapsed or experience or whatever, but things can change all the time. For me, it's about just that curiosity of like, well, what is going on here? Like, why is this person responding this way? And sometimes you can get to the bottom of it, sometimes you can't. Sometimes, like I said, it is just having that conversation and taking them aside and just being like, hey, like, is everything okay? What's going on? It's whatever it looks like. It can be that direct, or it can just try to just pay a bit more attention, right? And to step back and observe instead of like criticizing, and just seeing like, well, what's the dynamic over there? What's happening with these two people or within the team? Or trying to do what I can before I sort of get in their business.
Yeah.
And then asking the question in a, having that just honest conversation, I think can really, really help sometimes. Not always, right? You can't always get a straight answer. You can't always fix other people's pressures for them. But sometimes I think a lot of people just want to be heard. And a lot of times I have found that like when I've made the investment in having a conversation, it's not always to do with the thing that you think it has to do with, right? Like people are bringing other stuff into the office or into the team or into the room or whatever. So just acknowledging that, again, for me, it's that humility of like, I don't know everything about what's happening in that person's life or that person or any person's life. So maybe just give them an initial benefit of the doubt and then, try to intervene where possible, where relevant. And then if it keeps happening again and again and again, well, that's a different sort of conversation later, but at least in the first instance to try to understand it a bit. And then sometimes it's also just having to develop that intuition of like, well, what does the group need right now? Right? Like as a leader, we need to start paying more attention to like the atmosphere and the dynamics. And some of this, I think I just have a pretty decent sense of empathy. And so it's like, yes, if folks are stressed, can I do something just to raise the mood, to like raise the energy, and maybe it's just forcing everyone to take a break for a little while. Maybe it's, all right, you know what, we're just going to park this project and move on to something else. Like, we're not going to keep beating our heads against this brick wall. Like, maybe I need to be the grown up in the room and just take charge of like, we're going to do something to try to shift it. And then other times you just got to let it ride, and the reality is like, whatever they're dealing with, only they can handle, but at least you've tried. And for me, so it's always this, again, this like dynamic of controlling the controllables, manage what you can try to manage, try to understand, figure out what the real problem is instead of assuming what you think it is. But you won't always get it right. I don't always get it right. And you won't always come up with a solution or an answer. And that's something that, is hard to acknowledge, but at least like you've got to be willing to try.
Yeah. There's two questions that are coming up for me. One is, what would having no pressure in your life feel like for you?
I don't know, because I think, or I'm pretty confident that I need pressure in my life, and there's obviously a balance, but a sort of a degree, but I need pressure to like get me going. And so whether it's like coming from inside, more often than not, it comes from the inside, and that's perhaps. Actually, I don't know if it's better or worse, but more often than not, it comes from the inside. So, for example, like I leave many, many, many things to the last minute because I need that time pressure, right? Like it really does help me focus. It in some strange way, it forces me to be a lot more creative, and things happen and I come up with things that surprise me along the way. And so I create pressure even when I don't necessarily have it in that context. So I think I probably am the type of person who needs a little bit. Whether it's like the on balance is more self-driven versus external, I imagine I probably, I don't know if I would want a pressure-free life, but I imagine I would like less pressures that are external and more that are internally sort of defined and driven.
Yeah. Do you recognize the tipping point for you, Rupal, as to when that's really helpful pressure? I need it. I can relate to that description that you've just shared, by the way. Some of my best ideas come out literally as I'm walking towards the event.
Yes.
I mean, it's mad, completely mad. And I'm learning to trust that a lot more.
Same.
And I mean, it's a very interesting evolution, that I think, when you start to get under the covers with it. But when do you recognize that actually, okay, that's enough. That's now not helpful. I'm now overextending. What's the first signs for you when you're overextending?
I get really annoyed at my husband. And I'm serious. That's really what it looks like. There have been, and then actually it's funny. I had, I won't want to say crisis point, but a point on Monday morning where I was like, I blew up at my husband for a tiny little thing. And then as I'm like stewing and fuming in my like self-righteous anger about this thing, I realized I was like, nope, this is too much. This has nothing to do with what just happened. This is all about everything else. And so we've started a conversation around like what needs to shift, not in our lives, but like in the support that I have or in the support that we have at home that will take some of those pressures away. Because, my work requires me to travel a lot. I'm away from home a lot. So there's the emotional pressure of that. There's just the logistical sort of pressures. I'm doing a lot of really mentally taxing work. So again, feeling like I'm not getting to be as creative as I tend to need. And so it's like, how can I start doing all of the stuff that I know I need, right? Like building in more time for my creativity, but for just writing for writing's sake, as opposed to for, some article or whatever, and all of these little things. And so that's how I know it's like the, the early warning signs are the resentment and the anger towards someone who more often than not has nothing to do with what is actually going on. So we just had this happen a couple of days ago, and I'm still in the process of figuring out what the solution looks like, or a part of a solution can look like. But that for me is always the biggest alert. We can't keep doing this.
Yeah. Gosh, I so relate to that as well. Yeah, it's the people that matter most. Again, feel it. It's yeah, but I think what's really interesting about that is that as we all evolve, different requirements are needed to sort of almost come around us in terms of the pressure. If you think about, elite sportsmen and women, they have a whole system around them that is allowing them just to focus on being brilliant on the pitch or brilliant in the game, right? And yet we, us mere human beings who are trying to, evolve our own destiny or legacy, often underestimate the support networks that need to be around us in order to do that.
100%.
And the same for, businesses, same for organizations. I'm working with people who are so stretched and they just need a little bit more support around them so that they can center on the zone of genius, right?
100%. And Sarah, it's so funny because, what you said is exactly what it is. It's, as you said, as you evolve, like moving from, I'm going to use your sports analogy, from like amateur to semi-pro to pro to elite, like the systems behind you have to evolve. And for me, I've been less good about evolving those systems around me, both, and to be completely honest, both professionally and personally. It's that recognizing that this is actually a shift now, right? This isn't just we can keep doing everything the way we have. Like we need to do some serious changes and make some serious modifications because this is a different level now, right? Like there's no way that the training and nutrition program that you were on as an amateur is going to sustain you as an elite Olympian, And I think I have been a bit naive about that reality because you just, I'll just figure it out, right? Like it's just whatever, like it's not a big deal. And I remember it's funny because sometimes often what I find myself doing is relearning lessons that I've already learned, especially on this point, right?
Yeah.
And there are like the fundamentals are there, right? Like I know what I need. I know now how to expand it. It's just taking the steps to actually do it and to put it into practice. And it's big things, it's small things, but it's all, I find like, eliminating so many of like the micro pressures, the micro tasks, it can just free up so much mental load. And also for me, it helps with the emotional load because then all of a sudden you just don't feel like you're dropping some really, again, big or small plates, right? And I think that recognition, like I said, came to a head again after many years, just a couple of days ago. And I think it's important. I love the way you framed it about like, as you evolve, the system around you needs to evolve and expand sometimes.
Yeah. And allowing those pause moments to actually just see what's happening as opposed to charging on through it. I will. And particularly I think when you have the energy of, responding to pressure, wanting to do well, you have a forward energy. I can hear it in you, it's like we forget that, a little pause moment to recalibrate what's needed here.
Yes, exactly.
Might be helpful.
Yes. Yeah. And also might just make me a nicer person to be around, that for me is because I'm also very conscious again about like how I am at home and what I'm role modeling for my kids, right? What that dynamic is, not just in how I am with them, but what they see as, like in a relationship with, two adults.
Yes.
I just want to, look, I'm not trying to be perfect, but I do want to just try to be a bit more conscious, like you said, and just take that pause and say, look, maybe this isn't good for anyone. Like, what can we do differently here? Yeah.
So with this massive sprint that you're in and evolution that you're clearly in, Rupal, where do you get your recovery from?
Gosh. So I get it from alone time. I mean, like I desperately
How much of
need
that do you
alone
get?
time. Um, just enough to keep me going. I could probably do with more. And something that I'm also working on is actually building in that time, just saying, like, look, this week or these 2 days or whatever, and just literally just giving myself that time instead of just letting it happen whenever I can. So building in sort of like proper blocks. But I also get it generally in the mornings. So after the kids are at school, I will take a long, luxurious breakfast to just eat my breakfast, have my coffee, and watch some mindless television. Right? And that for me just gives me a little bit of that sense of like, oh, this was just for me. It's an indulgence. It's a mini luxury. But if I can build it in enough days, it'll feel like I've got given myself the juice to keep going. Two areas that have fallen off that I know I need is again the creativity stuff, not just consuming creativity, but actively being creative myself. And then secondly is the movement. I mean, that has just gone out the door, and it's something that I always struggle with, to be honest. Like I'll call it exercise, but it really is just more movement. Like even just going for a walk, like the first thing that I'll let go of when things get really busy and time pressed. Okay, well, I just won't exercise, or I won't go for that walk, or I won't, I'll just stay at my desk all day and just pound away at whatever needs getting done. And I feel it. I just feel this like latent energy in my body that needs to come out and is just not coming out.
Yeah.
I recognize like how much it gives me. I just haven't been good at prioritizing making that time for myself, but I get it in other small ways.
That no do gap.
Yeah.
I know it,
Oh,
but
yes.
I'm not
Oh,
doing
yes.
it. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I have many of those.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And yet you and I both know that to be able to perform under pressure, recovery
Oh,
is a
yeah.
vital component, right?
Of
We all,
course.
it's
Of
just,
course.
we know this, but
Yeah.
it does take some real effort to embrace it and put ourselves first to be able to
Right, right.
recover.
Yeah,
Yeah.
agreed. 100%
Yeah.
agreed. And I think for me, trying to like create a process or a system or like a blocking it out in my diary or whatever. All of the many experiments that I've done have not worked. The one thing, and this perhaps maybe will resonate with some of your audience, one of the things that I did that worked, and I don't know why I stopped doing it. I love moving and I love exercise. I genuinely do, but I'm really lazy. Like I really struggle to like get dressed, get my shoes on, and get out the door. And so what I told myself was like, okay, instead of fighting against this that you know about yourself, work with it, right? So how can you do that? Well, for me, lazy was like, okay, well, I can go on YouTube and I can do free yoga videos, like 15 minutes. There's no world in which I cannot give 15 minutes to
Yeah.
myself to just stay in my living room, turn on the television, and do some stretches, right? Like
Yeah.
that I cannot excuse. And I did, sort of like leaning into the laziness and working with my natural tendencies instead of constantly beating myself up for them, gave me this like consistent stretch. I think it was like 4 to 6 months where I was doing yoga 4 times a week. And I felt the difference, not even physically. Maybe there was a physical difference, but emotionally, mentally, like all of the things. It was the most consistent I'd ever been in my life. And cumulatively, I'd probably exercised more in that 6 month stretch than I had in the previous year, where I was like, okay, you have to go to the gym for an hour and then come back. But I would do it so inconsistently, right? So some of what I'm working on now is, again, how can I hack my system, right? Like not with a app or with a protein shake or whatever, or like an
Yeah.
ice bath, but like, this is who I am, right? I know I've been this way for basically the past 40 plus years of my life. Instead of working against it, how can I work with it? And that was probably one of the most successful experiments I ever did. And I sort of said earlier, I don't know why I stopped. I do know why I stopped, right? Because then just things got crazier, and I told myself, well, I don't have the luxury now of 15 minutes, even though I do, right? And so it's that reminding myself again. And then the other thing I do that might resonate with some of the folks in your audience, I make it all or nothing, and it's like either I do it, every day this week, or it doesn't count, right? Or I have to do a 2 hour yoga session now and build up to something mega, or what's the point? And I do that in many different capacities in life. Um, and so I'm trying to like again, go back to the basics and just let myself be lazy and start with 15 minutes, right? Maybe it gets to 2 hours. Maybe it just stays 15 minutes every day for the rest of my life. But that's a hell of a lot more than what I have been doing.
Sounds like a fantastic moment for recalibration in
You
terms
said
of
it.
what you want, right? And I think it is interesting understanding your rhythm and what works best for you. I've been playing with that as well in terms of, I relate. I love to have that sort of indulgent morning if I can. But I've been actively trying to get up earlier and doing my best thinking when there's no movement in the house and there's no noise in the house. And actually, I've been really, really enjoying that too. So it's difficult, isn't it? That balance between that's who I am, lean into it, or maybe I don't know who I am.
Yeah,
Let me experiment, right?
Yeah. I love that.
It's but all of that takes some effort.
Yeah. And also sometimes you don't know what the experiment is until it's sort of thrown in your face. So what you said about sort of starting to wake up earlier, I have found the same thing, but totally by chance, right? I never considered myself a morning person. And then when our youngest daughter was born and she was, waking up at all hours of the night to get fed, if I put her down around like 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning after her last feed, my mind was just like firing on all cylinders, right? And so I started leveraging that time from like 4 a.m. to 7 a.m., not because I wanted to be awake, but because I was awake. And like, why not just use it, right? And I found I loved it for that same reason. I was the most creative. The world was quiet. No one was in the house. No one was awake. Like I wasn't getting pinged. There was no demands on my time. It was just for me, my thoughts, my creativity. And I loved that time. And I kept that going for a while. I would also fall asleep when my daughter fell asleep, right? So I was in bed by 8, 9 o'clock, right? I could wake up at 4 or 5 and still have gotten a sufficient amount of sleep. And that's something else that, again, going back to basics, knowing who I am, knowing what has worked for me in the past, I'm experimenting with again, because, hey, well, if it worked then, let's just try it now. Maybe it won't work. Maybe, 4 years on, my body or my sort of what rhythms are a little bit different, but it's definitely worth trying because, you just don't know. And of course, until you try.
No, you don't. And also, I think when you've got children, your rhythms change as they grow. Like I've now got, 2 adult children. So suddenly life is different. I have more gaps where I'm not needed as in the way that I was needed in different ways, but you're not needed in the same way. So it's this adventure of evolution, I think we're talking about here. Rupal knows that creativity and movement matter to her, and yet by her own admission, she doesn't do enough of either. God, I'm sure many of us can relate to that. It is exactly the no-do gap. We know it, and yet we don't honour it for ourselves. Leaning into what she calls her laziness is a useful reframe. I'm not sure I'd call it that by the sound of her life, but anyway, that's what we often do. If we can't do it all, we say to ourselves, unhelpfully, that we're doing nothing or being lazy. I'd call it leaning into making it easier to do, or harder not to. Working with where we are now, leaning into where we are now, is a great way to make progress, whatever stage of life. And I think that's important to recognise. As our life evolves, so do our opportunities to make different choices about what matters and how we want to honour them. The thing that I especially like about this conversation is Rupal's use of the word experiment. It runs all the way through. It releases us from getting it right and instead encourages what we often call at Coaching Impact an explorer mindset. Sometimes we can actively experiment, and other times we can get an unexpected opportunity, like Rupal's breastfeeding example, when we discover something useful by accident. If you were to put your explorer hat on about discovering how to lean into something that you know you want more of, where would you start? I ask my guests 2 questions towards the end of the podcast, and they are, if you're listening to this and you would like to be better under pressure, what would be your 2 pay forwards to them? If you could choose 2 things, what would they be?
Ooh, to be better under pressure. 1, take yourself out of it whenever you can. So what I find sometimes is really helpful is, well, sort of like what we were saying, right? It can be that movement, and so it's not even exercise, but just physically moving, physically separating yourself from that pressured environment. And maybe, now that folks are working in hybrid contexts, it's less possible to sort of physically separate yourself from the pressure. But instead of just getting spun up and getting sucked into that vortex, I think sometimes for me, the biggest gift is to just leave. And sometimes that's physically leaving, like the office, the room, the Zoom session, whatever it is. And just collecting yourself before, like, not even your thoughts, just collect yourself, right? And try to like regroup internally before you keep trying to go at this thing. And then the second thing I would say, and this ties into some of the things that we talked about earlier, is just ask for help. There are so many people, I would venture to say, like, everybody out there could probably ask for help in some capacity, and they're just not doing it. Ask for help. And it might be you ask your partner or your spouse or your kids or your best friend or your colleague or your boss or your whoever. But like, again, it doesn't mean that everyone's going to be able to deliver what you ask for, but at the very least, give them a chance to support you, give them a chance to give you an idea. Maybe it's just you need to vent and you need to get it out of your system. And that is, enough in itself. But I think the asking for help is critical. It's not a sign of weakness, not even vulnerability, but just like asking for help instead of making it a guessing game, right? People will not be able to tell what you need. People can't intuit where you're at internally. And so if you need something, just ask.
How many leaders do you experience doing that?
Almost none. Actually, that's not fair. I will say, well, the fact that I'm working with them suggests that they have already, right? Like the fact that they want to sort of get some ideas or insights or just, figure some of this stuff out. I think
but
not enough.
Of their teams, like this is what I'm interested in. How often do they ask for help from their teams?
Oh, almost never. Yeah. And it's really surprising to me because I think it's this combination of not wanting to appear weak in some way, like they don't have all the answers, right? Because there's so much pressure. There's this crazy social notion, and it's everywhere, right? In pop culture and also in just like lived expectations of people that, like, if you're the leader, in order to justify your salary or justify your title, you have to have all the answers, right? Like, if you're coming to us, then how are you any different from us, and why should you be leading us? And I think that is obviously it's such a false construct, but because the reality is that, of course, you're not going to be able to solve every problem. You might need help from. So I think there's some of that is that resistance is because if I ask for help, then, how does that make me look? And so it's sort of like a reputational, maybe sort of a bit of ego involved. And again, the more senior folks, I think there's perhaps even more hesitance for, those same reasons. So I don't think they do it enough. And I think some of what I try to work with them on is it's just framing it in a different way, right? Instead of making it like, hey, give me the answers or give me the solution, it's let's just have a conversation about this. This is what's going on. This is where we're struggling as an organization or as a team. I'd love to hear your thoughts, right? And it doesn't have to be like save the day and come and help me. It's just, what are you thinking? Because they're going to be thinking it anyway, right? Like they're not dumb. They're experiencing the same challenges and problems you are, maybe in a modified way. And so for me, it's like, if there's an elephant in the room, talk about the elephant, right? Not don't say like, hey guys, like it's your duty now to chase this elephant away. No, but like, what are we going to do collectively? Like, I would love to hear from you, and let's figure this out together, because you are a team, right? That's the whole thing. It's a team. It's not one person. Yes, of course, the authority and the buck stops with you as the leader. But I think in just inviting it as a conversation can be really helpful. And it also helps them manage their expectations of you, the organization, et cetera, and shows that, like, again, it's that role modeling of, well, this is the behavior that leaders can exhibit, right? You don't have to have it all figured out. When I, as a team member, now evolve into a leadership role later, I will create that same condition of dialogue, of conversation, whatever it is, that can be really, really fruitful. So I would say, yes, many don't do it, but I think that there's a shift, there's a growing understanding, because pressures are so great and so intense, and everybody pretty much is being asked to do more with less, that there's this awareness now that it has to be more of a flat leadership, leadership as everybody's responsibility to some extent, owning the problem is everybody's responsibility, and how we go about it. The final decision is in the hands of a few, but let's co-create this solution together.
Yeah. Fabulous. Thank you, Rupal. What a great conversation. Loved it.
It was my pleasure to be here. Thank you, Sara.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Better Under Pressure with me, Sara Milne Rowe. If you enjoyed it, please do subscribe and let us know what you found useful or what you'd like to know more about. And don't forget, if you'd like to sign up for our fortnightly Pressure Points newsletter, where I summarise key points from each conversation, you can find a link at saramilnerowe.com. If you're interested in any of the practices mentioned, check out my book, The Shed Method. Alternatively, you can find us at Coaching Impact or me on LinkedIn and Instagram. Better Under Pressure was produced by the fab team at Smart Cookie Media. Thanks so much for listening, and until next time, goodbye.